In my last video, I talked about how you should always shoot at ISO 100 to get the least amount of noise in your photo and get the cleanest looking photo. But it's not always the case that you can shoot at ISO 100. You may want to actually bump up that ISO to get a good photo. You can't always shoot in a nicely lit environment. Sometimes you're shooting in the evening, sometimes you're shooting in the morning, or you're just in a location that's just blocked by the sun, you don't have a whole lot of light. So in cases like that, you actually have to bump up your ISO. For me, the rule of thumb is to work on your shutter speed, your aperture, and then worry about your ISO. For example, I shoot bird photography a lot of the times, and to freeze the motion, I have to shoot at a higher shutter speed. So I go into the process knowing that my shutter speed is going to be fast, which means less light. Also, I try and open up my aperture because I like the blurred background, but I don't open it up too much that my focus range is very narrow. You kind of got to go into these photos knowing what you want to shoot before you shoot, and then you can adjust your ISO. So now knowing that my shutter speed is going to be fast and my aperture is going to be around f4, f5, I know that that's not going to let a ton of light in. So I'll bump up my ISO to around 1,000, maybe more, depending on how much light I have in my scene. If I'm shooting a landscape shot, my camera is going to be on a tripod, so I know I can do a slower shutter speed and not have to worry about camera shake. My camera can just sit there and be perfectly still. Now my aperture is going to be at f10, f11, so that brings in less light. So then I'll adjust my ISO bit by bit until I find an exposure that works for me. Not too high, but not too low that I'm going to be messing it up with noise. Because the ISO dial on your camera works more like a gain knob on an amp. The signal's already going through it, you're just turning it up a little bit to make it more sensitive. That's how the camera sensor works. It's not creating light, it's just making your sensor more sensitive to the light that's already there. It's a really good thing to learn how to adjust your ISO, because the worst thing is coming home and looking at your photo and seeing that it's a noisy mess. That's just so infuriating. Now, I've said in the past that you shouldn't worry too much about noise in your photos, which is true, because noise can actually add an artistic effect to it. But if you go overboard with it, you won't get a sharp photo. It'll just start looking all blurry and blocky and noisy. Now, there are programs like Lightroom that denoises your photo if you shoot in RAW, and it works really good. The downside to it is if it's really noisy and you want a really clean image and you dial it all the way up, the AI will kind of make it look like a painterly effect, which, you know, you either love it or you hate it. That's why one of the best things to do is to shoot RAW on your camera, because you can hold so much more information in every photo that you take that it makes editing the photo way easier. If you're shooting JPEG and your ISO is really high, there's not really a way to come back from it. Even when you run it through denoise software, a JPEG just doesn't have the same amount of information in its file as a RAW file does. The best thing to do is to get it right in camera first. So take multiple shots, take multiple exposures, mess around with your shutter speed, your aperture, and then your ISO, just so you can have multiple different images that you can play with. I know when you're first starting out, it can be really easy just to adjust that ISO dial just to get the proper exposure, but trust me, balancing shutter speed and aperture is the way to go. Don't just crank up your ISO to get that desired exposure. You'll end up with noise and it just won't look good and it won't be sharp. Trust me, it'll only bring disappointment. So that's all I really wanted to touch on in this video. I just wanted to clarify from my last video that there are reasons to shoot at a higher ISO. If you guys enjoy this sort of content, subscribe. I'd love to see you guys back here hanging out in another video. And that's it for today. Thanks, guys. Peace.